Before the organ finished its final note, before the 300 guests rose from their seats, a voice at the altar whispered something that did not belong in a church. "Can you come get me?" The words were so quiet that even the priest didn't hear them. But the maid of honor did, and her face went pale. Because the second thing the bride whispered was worse. "He's going to kill me if I stay." 40 feet from the altar, standing in the shadow of a marble pillar, a man who had built empires on silence heard every word, and Kalen Voss, who had watched men beg and never flinched, felt something cold move through his chest. Because he had heard that exact whisper before, over 4 decades ago, from his mother. The bride's name was Marit. She was 27 years old. Her dress cost $14,000. Her veil had been hand-stitched by a designer in Milan. Her bouquet was white roses and baby's breath, trembling slightly in hands that could not stay still. To the guests, she looked like a portrait. The kind of bride you see in magazines, the kind whose smile is practiced, whose posture is perfect, whose eyes catch the stained glass light in a way that makes old women weep. But portraits don't shake. And Marit was shaking. Not the way nervous brides shake, with giddy energy and champagne jitters. She was shaking the way prey shakes when the predator is close enough to smell. The phone pressed against her palm was the size of a credit card. She had taped it inside her bouquet 3 hours ago, hidden beneath the stems, invisible to everyone except her. The maid of honor, a woman named Petra, had spent the entire ceremony pretending not to see it. But when Marit lifted the bouquet to her face as if smelling the roses and whispered those words, Petra stopped pretending. "Marit?" Petra's voice was barely audible. "You can't. He's right there." Marit's eyes did not move toward the groom. They did not need to. She knew exactly where Brennan Solano was standing. She had spent the last 3 years learning to track him without looking. Learning to feel the weight of his attention the way animals feel weather changing. He was 2 feet to her left, smiling, waiting. His hand rested on the small of her back, light as a promise, heavy as a threat. The priest was speaking. Something about love, something about eternity, something about God. But Marit heard none of it. She heard only the silence on the other end of the phone. The call had connected. Someone had answered, but they had said nothing. And then the line went dead. The bouquet lowered, the phone disappeared back into the stems, and Marit Lindgren, in 11 minutes, would become a wife to a man who had already broken her 1,000 times. But she did not know that across the cathedral, in the shadow, where the candlelight could not reach, Kalen Voss had already made a decision. He had not come to this wedding for her. He had come for business, for connections, for the quiet politics of powerful men. But business could wait. Because the sound of that whisper had unlocked something he had buried for more than 4 decades. And Kalen Voss never ignored a ghost. Kalen did not move from his position behind the pillar. He had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a man could do in a room full of people was remain unseen until he chose otherwise. He was 53 years old. His hair was silver at the temples, black everywhere else, combed back in a way that made his face look like something carved from granite. His eyes were the color of iron after rain, and they had the quality of mirrors, reflecting everything, revealing nothing. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most cars. No tie. A single ring on his left hand, a signet with no crest. Just a flat black stone that caught no light. He ran an organization that operated in 9 cities. He employed over 400 people. He had senators who owed him favors, judges who feared his lawyers, and a reputation that moved through rooms before he did, clearing space, lowering voices, adjusting postures. Men who had built their lives on fearlessness became careful in his presence. Women who had married power learned to look away when he entered. But Kalen had not been born into this. He had been made, slowly, painfully, by a childhood that taught him what happened when no one intervened. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. One text. One word. Sent to a man named Tiernan who had worked beside him for 19 years and never once questioned an order. Watch. Then he put the phone away and returned his attention to the altar, to the bride whose hands would not stop trembling, to the groom whose smile did not reach his eyes, to the maid of honor who kept glancing toward the cathedral doors as if calculating the distance. Kalen had seen that calculation before. He had watched his mother make it 100 times, measuring the steps to the exit, counting the seconds, wondering if this time, maybe this time, there would be a way out. There never was. Not for her. But Kalen was no longer a boy hiding behind a door, listening to his mother cry. He was something else now. Something his father had tried to beat out of him and failed. Something his mother had whispered into his ear on the last night of her life. "Promise me," she had said. "Promise me you'll become strong enough to stop it." He had promised, and Kalen Voss did not break promises. St. Aurelius Cathedral had stood for 112 years on the corner of Verity and Ashmore, a monument to old money and older guilt. It was the kind of church that wealthy families reserved generations in advance, the kind where sins were forgiven with donations, where silence was purchased with stained glass, where every pew had a brass plaque engraved with a name that appeared in history books. The ceiling arched 60 feet above the marble floor, painted with scenes of angels descending and sinners ascending, all of them reaching toward a light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The windows were masterpieces, 12 of them, each depicting a saint in the moment of their martyrdom. Saint Lucia holding her own eyes, Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, Saint Catherine bound to her wheel. There was something fitting about it, Kalen thought. A wedding surrounded by portraits of suffering dressed up as devotion. The pews held 327 guests, arranged in perfect rows, dressed in suits and gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year. They were politicians, investors, old blood aristocrats, and new money climbers. They were people who had learned to smile at cruelty and call it ambition. The flowers had been imported from Holland. $17,000 worth of white roses, lilies, and orchids arranged along every aisle. Their perfume filled the cathedral with a sweetness that bordered on suffocating. The organist played Pachelbel, the same piece played at every wedding, so familiar it had become meaningless. But beneath the music, beneath the perfume, beneath the candlelight, there was something else. A tension that lived in the pauses, the way the bride held herself too still, the way the groom's fingers pressed into her back just slightly too hard, the way the priest spoke a little too quickly, as if he sensed something wrong but had been paid well enough to ignore it. The guests noticed nothing. They saw what they expected to see. A beautiful bride. A powerful groom. A union that would merge two families, two fortunes, two futures. They saw a love story. But Kalen saw the truth. He had spent 53 years learning to read the grammar of violence, the syntax of control, the punctuation of fear. And this wedding was not a love story. It was a sentence. The kind you served. The kind you survived if you were lucky. The priest asked if anyone objected. The cathedral held its breath. 327 guests remained silent. Murrett's hands tightened around the bouquet. Brennan's smile widened. And in the shadow of the marble pillar, Kalen Voss began to move. Merritt Lindgren had not always been this. There was a time, 4 years ago, when she laughed without checking who was listening, when she wore colors that she chose herself, when she walked into rooms without scanning for exits, without measuring distances, without calculating how many steps it would take to reach a door. She had been a restoration artist at the Bellamy Museum. She specialized in 19th century oil paintings, the kind that had been damaged by time, by water, by the slow violence of neglect. She would spend months on a single canvas, repairing cracks invisible to the untrained eye, reviving colors that had faded into ghosts of themselves. She had been gifted, but that was before Brennan. Now she stood at an altar in a dress she had not chosen, holding flowers she had not picked, preparing to speak vows she had not written. And the only thing she had chosen, the phone hidden in her bouquet, had failed her. The call had connected. She had heard breathing. And then nothing. Her sister Kestrel lived 200 miles away in a town called Harrowfield. They had not spoken in 14 months. Not because Marit didn't want to, but because Brennan had made it impossible. He monitored her phone. He read her emails. He checked the mileage on her car and compared it to the routes she claimed to have taken. So Marit had stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped reaching out. But 3 weeks ago, she had found a way. A burner phone purchased with cash at a gas station 40 miles outside the city, hidden in the lining of a coat Brennan never wore, charged in 15-minute increments while he showered. She had called Kestrel once, just once, at 2 a.m, whispering into the dark of the bathroom with the water running to cover her voice. I need help. I need to get out. I don't know how. Kestrel had cried. She had promised. She had said, I'll find a way. Just tell me when. And Marit had said, the wedding. It's the only time I'll be surrounded by people. It's the only time he might not be watching every second. She had been wrong about that. Brennan was always watching. Even now, standing beside her at the altar, his eyes moved across the cathedral with the practiced sweep of a man who trusted no one. His hand on her back was not affection. It was a leash. He had never said the words out loud. He didn't need to. He had said them in 1,000 other ways. In the way he chose her clothes each morning, laying them out on the bed like a uniform. In the way he timed her errands, checking her location on an app she was not supposed to know about. In the way he smiled when she flinched, as if her fear was a compliment. Marit had discovered how to survive him the way sailors discover how to survive storms. By reading the signs. By knowing when to be still. By understanding that sometimes the safest thing you can do is disappear inside yourself and wait for it to pass. But storms pass. Brennan did not. And today, in 11 minutes, she would sign a document that would make escape even harder. A prenuptial agreement that gave him control of everything, her finances, her property, her future. She had signed it 3 months ago in his lawyer's office, with his hand on her shoulder and his voice in her ear. This is just a formality, darling. You trust me, don't you? She had nodded. She had signed. She had smiled. And then she had gone home and stood in the shower for 45 minutes, letting the water run until it turned cold, because that was the only place in the house where she was allowed to cry. The priest was still speaking. His voice rose and fell like waves against a shore. Marit's fingers tightened around the bouquet. The phone was still there, silent, useless. Kestrel was not coming. No one was coming. And in 11 minutes, she would say, I do, and the door would close forever. The first time Brennan hit her was 6 months into their relationship. They had been at a charity gala. Marit had been talking to a colleague from the museum, a man named Dashiell who specialized in Byzantine iconography. It was nothing. A conversation about pigment analysis. Professional, innocent, forgettable. But Brennan had watched from across the room, and when they got home that night, he had asked her about it. Who was he? A colleague. From work. You were laughing. He made a joke about restoration solvents. It was funny. Brennan had nodded slowly. His face had been calm. His voice had been soft. And then his hand had moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap had knocked her into the wall. Her head had struck the corner of a picture frame, a photograph of the two of them in Venice. She had slid to the floor, dizzy, confused, her ear ringing with a high-pitched sound that wouldn't stop. And Brennan had knelt beside her and cradled her face in his hands and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just love you so much. The thought of losing you makes me crazy." She had believed him. That was the part that haunted her most. Not the slap, not the ringing in her ear, not the bruise that bloomed across her cheekbone like a purple flower. She had believed him. She had told herself it was an aberration, a moment of passion, a mistake that would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, and again. Not always slaps. Sometimes it was words. The slow, surgical dismantling of everything she believed about herself. "You're not as smart as you think you are. Your friends only tolerate you because of me. Your sister never really loved you. She was jealous. That's why she moved away. No one will ever love you the way I do." He said these things calmly, casually, the way you might comment on the weather. And each word landed like a drop of water on stone. Alone, they meant nothing. Together, over months and years, they carved a canyon. Marit stopped seeing her friends. She stopped calling her sister. She stopped wearing the colors she loved, the deep reds and ocean blues, because Brennan said they made her look desperate for attention. She wore beige now, gray, white, colors that disappeared. She became a ghost in her own life. The proposal had come 18 months ago, on a rooftop in Barcelona, with the city glittering below them and a ring that cost more than her annual salary. She had said yes because she didn't know how to say no. She had said yes because saying no meant consequences she could not predict. She had said yes because somewhere in the wreckage of who she used to be, a small voice still whispered, "Maybe this will fix him. Maybe marriage will make him feel secure." That voice had been wrong. 3 weeks before the wedding, Brennan had found a notebook. It was hidden in the back of her closet, a small leather journal where Marit had written everything, every bruise, every insult, every night she had spent crying in the bathroom with the water running. Brennan had read every page, and then he had sat her down at the kitchen table and placed the notebook between them and smiled. "If you ever try to leave me," he had said, "I will destroy you. I will tell everyone you're mentally unstable. I will have you committed. I will take everything you have, including your sanity." He had picked up the notebook and torn it in half. "And if you ever write anything like this again, I won't stop at the notebook." He had not specified what he meant by that. He didn't need to. Marit had understood. And now she stood at an altar, 11 minutes from forever, with a silent phone in her bouquet and no one coming to save her. The priest asked her to repeat after him. She opened her mouth, and behind her she heard a door open. Kalen Voss was 9 years old when he learned what a broken rib sounded like. Not his own, his mother's. They had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Ashford Projects, a cluster of concrete buildings on the east side of the city, where the streetlights flickered and the elevators smelled like rust. His father, Dominic, worked at the shipyard during the day and drank at a bar called the Anchor at night. When Dominic came home sober, he was silent, distant, a ghost who sat in front of the television and stared at nothing. When Dominic came home drunk, he was a storm. That night, the night Kalen learned the sound, his mother had made the wrong dinner. Meatloaf instead of pot roast. A small mistake. A meaningless mistake. But Dominic had wanted pot roast. Kalen had been hiding behind the kitchen door, watching through the crack between the hinges. He saw his father grab his mother by the arm. He saw her try to pull away. He saw the punch land in her side with a sound like a branch snapping. His mother had gasped, not screamed. She never screamed. Screaming brought neighbors. Neighbors brought questions. Questions brought shame. So she gasped, and she folded, and she sank to the floor. And Dominic stepped over her and walked to the refrigerator and opened a beer. Kaylin had wanted to run to her. He had wanted to scream, to fight, to do something. But he was 9 years old. He weighed 62 pounds, and his father was a monster who wore a man's face. So Kaylin did nothing. He stood behind the door and watched his mother crawl to the counter and pull herself up and finish making dinner with one arm pressed against her broken ribs. And when she saw him watching, when her eyes met his through the crack in the door, she shook her head. "Not now, baby. Go to your room." He had gone to his room. He had sat on his bed. He had pressed his hands over his ears. But he could still hear her, moving slowly through the kitchen, setting the table, serving the meatloaf, saying, "I'm sorry, Dominic. I'll make pot roast tomorrow." That was the architecture of his childhood. Not the hitting, though there was plenty of that. It was the apology. The way she said sorry for his violence. The way she made his cruelty her fault. The way she shrank until there was almost nothing left of the woman she had been. She died when Kaylin was 14. Not from a beating, from pneumonia. But Kaylin knew the truth. Her body had simply given up. It had carried too much for too long, and one winter it decided it was finished. He had stood beside her hospital bed and held her hand and listened to her breathe. Shallow, wet breaths that rattled in her chest like stones in a jar. And in the last hour, when the nurses had stepped out, she had opened her eyes and looked at him. "Promise me," she had whispered. "Promise me you'll become strong enough." Strong enough for what? To stop it. When you see it? "Promise me you won't look away." He had promised. And then she had closed her eyes, and the rattling had stopped, and Kaylin Voss had become something else. He had spent the next 39 years building an empire, accumulating power, becoming the kind of man that other men feared. Not for revenge. His father had died in a bar fight 2 years after his mother, killed by a stranger over a gambling debt. There was no one left to punish. Kaylin had built his empire for one reason only, so that when he saw it again, when he heard that whisper, when he recognized that flinch, when he watched a woman apologize for someone else's violence, he would have the power to do what he couldn't do at 9 years old. He would stop it. And now, standing in the shadow of St. Aurelius Cathedral, watching a bride tremble at an altar, he heard his mother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "You promised." Kaylin stepped out of the shadow and walked toward the light. The door that opened was not the main entrance. It was a side door, near the confessional booths, used by clergy and staff. It made no sound, but Marit felt it. The change in pressure. The shift in air. The way the candle flames near the altar flickered for half a second, as if something had disturbed the stillness. She did not turn around. She could not turn around. Brennan's hand was still on her back, and any unexpected movement would be noted, catalogued, punished later. But her eyes moved to Petra, and Petra's face had changed. The maid of honor was staring past Marit's shoulder, toward the side aisle, with an expression that Marit could not read. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to confusion. The priest continued speaking. His voice droned on about sacred bonds and holy unions. Marit's lips moved automatically, repeating the words she was supposed to repeat. But her mind was somewhere else. Who had come through that door? Kaylin moved down the side aisle with the unhurried pace of a man who had never needed to rush in his life. His footsteps were silent on the marble. His face revealed nothing. To the guests who noticed him, and few did, he appeared to be a latecomer finding his seat. Nothing unusual. But Kaylin was not looking for a seat. He was looking at the groom, Brennan Solano, 34 years old, heir to the Solano shipping fortune, board member of 3 corporations, philanthropist, according to the newspapers, monster, according to the way his bride flinched when his fingers pressed into her back. Kaylin had known men like Brennan his entire life. Men who wore civilization like a costume. Men who smiled for cameras and shattered bones behind closed doors. Men who believed that money and status made them untouchable. They were always wrong about that last part. Kalen stopped walking. He was now standing at the end of a pew, 15 feet from the altar, close enough to see the bride's face in profile. She was beautiful, but that was not what he noticed. He noticed the way she held her shoulders, pulled inward, protective. He noticed the way her jaw was clenched, as if she were biting down on words she couldn't say. He noticed the almost invisible tremor in her hands. He had seen that posture before, in his mother, in the mirror, when he was 9 years old and trying to make himself small enough to disappear. The priest asked the groom to recite his vows. Brennan turned to face Merritt fully, taking both her hands in his. And for one moment, his eyes flicked past her shoulder. They landed on Kalen. The two men looked at each other across 15 feet of marble and candlelight. Brennan's smile did not waver. But something behind it changed. A question. A calculation. Who is that man? Why is he watching me? Kalen did not look away. He did not smile. He simply stood there and let Brennan see exactly what he was. A witness. Brennan turned back to his bride and began reciting his vows. But his voice was slightly different now. Slightly faster. Slightly less certain. And Kalen knew that the first crack had formed. The ceremony ended with a kiss that looked perfect and felt like suffocation. Brennan's lips pressed against Marit's for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for the photographer to capture it. Short enough to seem tasteful. When he pulled back, he whispered something in her ear. "You're shaking. Stop it, stop." Marit forced her body to still. Experience had taught her how to override her own nervous system, how to command her muscles to obey even when every instinct screamed at her to run. She smiled for the photographer. She walked down the aisle on Brennan's arm. She accepted the congratulations of 327 guests. No one asked if she was happy, because brides were always happy. That was the script. The reception was held in the cathedral's adjacent hall, a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and tables draped in white linen. Marit stood beside Brennan, receiving guests, smiling until her face ached. And then she saw him. The man from the side aisle, the one with the silver-templed hair and the iron-colored eyes. He was standing near the bar, holding a glass of whiskey he had not sipped, and watching her. Brennan noticed too. His hand tightened on Marit's waist. "Do you know that man?" Marit shook her head. "No. Stay here. I'm going to find out who he is." He released her waist and moved toward the bar. And for the first time in 3 hours, Marit was alone. Petra appeared at her side almost instantly. "Marit." The phone. "Did it work?" "No." The line went dead. Kestrel didn't answer. Petra's face crumpled. "Oh God. Marit, I'm so sorry. It's fine." The words came automatically. The survival lie. The phrase every woman in her situation learned to say without thinking. But Petra knew better. Petra had seen the bruises. "It's not fine," Petra whispered. "We have to do something. There's nothing to do. The ceremony is over. I signed the papers. It's done." Petra opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice came from behind them. Low, calm, controlled. "It's not done until you decide it's done." Merritt turned. The man with the iron eyes was standing 6 feet away, and Brennan was nowhere in sight. Marit's first instinct was to step back. She had developed that instinct from Brennan, the automatic retreat when a man approached too quickly. But this man did not move closer. He stood exactly where he was, hands visible at his sides, posture deliberately open. "My name is Kalen Voss," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to touch you. And if you want me to walk away right now, I will." Marit stared at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who heard what you said at the altar." The blood drained from Marit's face. The phone call. The whisper. He had heard. I don't know what you're talking about. The lie came automatically, but even as she said it, she knew it was useless. You said, "Can you come get me?" And then you said, "He's going to kill me if I stay." Marit's hands began to tremble again. Please. Please don't tell him. I'm not going to tell him anything. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not for me. For yourself. Marit said nothing, but she didn't walk away. If you could leave right now, tonight, and never see him again, would you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Yes. The word was barely audible, but Kaylin heard it. Then here's what I'm offering. There's a car outside. Black sedan. Driver's name is Tiernan. If you walk out the side entrance of this hall, through the kitchen, and through the service door, he'll be waiting. Where would he take me? Somewhere safe. A place your husband doesn't know about. Marit shook her head. You don't understand. Brennan has connections. He has lawyers. I know what he has. Kaylin's voice did not change, but something beneath it hardened. I also know what I have. And I promise you, whatever resources he thinks he controls, they will not be enough. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Kaylin looked at her for a long moment. His face shifted. The mask moved half an inch. Because someone should have done it for my mother. And no one did. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the direction of a life. Marit looked at Petra. Petra's eyes were wide, uncertain, and afraid. She looked back at Kaylin. What about Petra? She helped me. If I disappear, Brennan will blame her. Petra comes too. If she wants. Petra grabbed Marit's arm. Marit. We don't know this man. She was right. But Marit also knew what waited for her if she stayed. The slow erosion, the daily diminishments, the way Brennan would carve away everything she was until there was nothing left. She looked at Kaylin Voss, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in a very long time. Not pity, not savior complex, not the transactional calculation of a man who wanted something in return. She saw recognition. Okay, Marit whispered. Petra hesitated for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. Kaylin turned and walked toward the kitchen entrance without looking back. He did not offer his arm. He did not hover. He simply moved, creating a path, leaving it to them to follow. And they followed. The safe house was not what Marit had expected. She had imagined something cold, industrial. Instead, Tiernan had driven them to a brownstone in the Carmine Hill district, a quiet neighborhood of tree-lined streets and wrought iron fences. The apartment occupied the entire 3rd floor. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a kitchen with copper pots hanging above the stove, a living room with built-in bookshelves and a fireplace that looked like it actually worked. Marit stood in the center of the living room and felt something she could not name. It was not relief. Relief implied that the danger was over, and she knew it wasn't. It was space. For the first time in 3 years, she was standing in a room where Brennan could not see her. Petra sat on the couch, still in her maid of honor dress, her mascara smudged. Kaylin sat in a chair across from them. He had removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves. He had not spoken since they arrived. He had simply let them breathe. It was Marit who finally spoke. He proposed in Barcelona. The whole city was glittering below us, and everyone in the restaurant applauded. She paused. Her voice was flat, distant. I said yes because I was afraid to say no. Kaylin said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The first time he hit me was 6 months after we started dating. We'd been at a gala. I was talking to a colleague about paint pigments. Nothing. He hit me so hard my head cracked a picture frame. She looked at her hands. The wedding ring was still there. Seeing it made her stomach turn. She pulled it off her finger and set it on the coffee table. I believed him when he apologized. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. There's nothing to forgive, Kaylin said quietly. Men like him are architects. They build the prison around you one brick at a time. By the time you see the walls, you're already inside. Marit looked up at him. He isolated me. My friends. My family. My sister Kestrel. We used to talk every day. Now it's been 14 months. The phone call at the altar, Kaylin said. You were trying to reach her. She was supposed to come. But the line went dead. She may still be trying. Tiernan is making calls. If your sister is looking for you, we'll find her. Marit shook her head. You keep saying we, but I still don't understand why. Kaylin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fireplace, at the empty grate. When I was 9 years old, my father broke my mother's ribs because she made the wrong dinner. The words landed like stones in still water. I watched it happen. I was hiding behind the kitchen door and I saw everything. And I couldn't do anything because I was a child. He looked back at Marit. She died when I was 14. From exhaustion. From a body that had been asked to carry too much for too long. His voice did not waver, but something beneath it was raw. The last thing she said to me was, "Promise me you'll become strong enough to stop it." He paused. I made that promise, and I've spent the last 39 years keeping it. Marit felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. You're not taking anything from me, Marit. You're giving me the chance to do what I couldn't do when I was 9 years old. That's not charity. That's redemption. Marit stared at him across the lamplight, and for the first time since she had said "I do" at the altar, she exhaled. Kaylin's phone buzzed at 11:43 that night. He stepped into the hallway to answer it. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Odessa Vane. Odessa was 51 years old. She had silver-gray hair cut short, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice like a scalpel. She had spent 23 years as a prosecutor before transitioning to private practice, where she specialized in cases that other attorneys considered impossible. She had never lost a custody battle. She had never failed to secure a protective order. Tonight, Kaylin was calling in the first of 3 favors she owed him. "Tell me," Odessa said. Bride, 27, 3 years of documented abuse, though the documentation is limited. He found her journal and destroyed it. She fled the wedding reception 2 hours ago. The husband is Brennan Solano. There was a pause. Solano, the shipping family. Yes. His lawyers are Whitmore and Castellan. They're good, but not invincible. No. Odessa exhaled slowly. What does she want? Annulment. Protection. Freedom. Does she have evidence? Some. Hospital visit 18 months ago. Facial fractures she claimed were from a fall. A coworker may have photographs of bruises. What about family? A sister. Kestrel Lindgren. Lives in Harrowfield. They've been estranged for 14 months, but not by choice. We need that sister. Judges respond to testimony about behavioral changes. Tiernan is already searching. Good. I'll file for an emergency protective order first thing tomorrow. Kaylin was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Whatever you need. Whatever it costs. This isn't about money, Kaylin." "I know. It's about that promise you made." Kaylin closed his eyes. "Yes. I'll call you in the morning with an update." The line went dead. Kaylin stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he pushed open the door and went back inside. Marit looked up. "What happens now?" "Now," Kaylin said, "we build you a future." The next 72 hours moved with a speed that Marit could barely comprehend. On the first morning, Odessa Vane arrived at the brownstone at 8:15. She sat across from Marit at the kitchen table and asked her to tell the story from the beginning. Marit told her everything. When she finished, Odessa closed her notebook and looked at her. "You did the right thing. Every decision you made, From packing the phone to walking out of that reception, you did the right thing. I need you to remember that. The emergency protective order was filed that afternoon. A judge reviewed the documentation, the hospital records, the photographs from Petra's phone, the sworn statement, and signed the order before 5 o'clock. Brennan Solano was served at his family's estate that evening. His lawyers responded within hours. They filed a motion to dismiss, claiming that Marit was mentally unstable, that the accusations were fabricated. Odessa had anticipated this. On the second day, a psychiatrist named Dr. Elias Crow conducted a comprehensive evaluation. The report was unambiguous. Ms. Lindgren displays no signs of psychosis, delusion, or mental instability. She presents as a trauma survivor with symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological and physical abuse. The motion to dismiss was denied. On the third day, Tiernan found Kestrel. She had been searching for Marit since the wedding. She had driven 200 miles to the cathedral, arrived 4 hours after the ceremony, and spent the next 2 days calling hospitals and police stations. Kestrel arrived at the brownstone at 6 o'clock that evening. Marit heard her voice in the hallway and ran. The two sisters collided in the doorway, arms wrapping around each other, 14 months of silence dissolving in a single moment. "I tried to call you," Marit sobbed, "at the altar. I tried to call you, but the line went dead. I know. I was driving. I dropped my phone and it slid under the seat. By the time I found it, the call had ended. And then you ran." Kestrel pulled back and looked at her sister's face. "You ran. You actually ran." Marit nodded, and Kestrel smiled through her own tears. "That's my sister." The following weeks brought more victories. Odessa filed for annulment on the grounds of fraud and coercion. She presented evidence that Marit had signed the prenuptial agreement under duress. Meanwhile, the police opened an investigation. 3 of Marit's former colleagues came forward. They had seen the bruises, they had noticed the changes. Now they knew. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Brennan did not attend. His lawyers spoke for him, but their words fell flat against the weight of evidence. 6 weeks after the wedding that never truly ended, the annulment was granted. The judge read his ruling in a courtroom that Marit did not attend. She watched via video link from the brownstone, with Kestrel on one side and Petra on the other. The evidence presented establishes a clear pattern of coercion, manipulation, and abuse. The marriage between Marit Lindgren and Brennan Solano is hereby annulled. The protective order will remain in effect indefinitely. Marit put her hands over her face and wept. And somewhere across the city, in an office with a view of the harbor, Brennan Solano received a visitor, a man named Tiernan, who delivered a single envelope containing a single sheet of paper. The paper held no threats, no demands, just a list of names. Every politician Brennan had bribed, every judge he had influenced, every inspector he had paid, and at the bottom, a single line. This list exists in 17 locations. Any attempt to contact, harm, or interfere with Marit Lindgren will result in its immediate distribution. Brennan stared at that paper for a long time. Then he called his lawyers and told them to withdraw all remaining motions. He never contacted Marit again. The apartment was not large, but it was hers. 3 rooms on the second floor of a building in the Northwick district, a neighborhood of bakeries and bookshops. The lease was in her name. The keys were in her hand. The deadbolt was heavy and solid and made a sound like a promise when it slid into place. Marit stood in the center of the living room on her first night and looked around. The furniture was secondhand. A couch with faded blue cushions, a wooden table with chairs that didn't quite match. Everything was worn. Nothing was expensive. And all of it was hers. Marit walked to the front door. She touched the deadbolt. She turned it, listening to the mechanism engage. Then she turned it again, and again. She stood there for 5 minutes, locking and unlocking the door, feeling the weight of the metal, the certainty of its function. This door locked from the inside. She controlled who entered. She controlled who stayed. For the first time in 3 years, she was the architect of her own space. She slid down the door and sat on the floor with her back against the wood. And she laughed. Not the careful, measured laugh she had performed for Brennan. A real laugh. She laughed until she cried. And then she cried until there was nothing left. And then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. A man was closing up his flower shop. 2 children were racing each other down the sidewalk. Ordinary life. The kind that was hers again. 4 months later, on a Saturday morning in early March, Marit woke to the sound of rain against her window. She lay in bed for a long moment, listening. There was a time when rain had made her anxious. Brennan's moods had always been worse on gray days. But now, rain was just rain. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the drops slide down the glass. The apartment had changed. She had painted the walls a soft blue. She had hung cream-colored curtains. She had placed a small table by the window with a single chair, where she sat each day to sketch. She was drawing again. Not restoration work, not yet. But her own work. Charcoal sketches of things she saw on her walks. The flower shop on the corner. The old woman on the stoop. The pigeons in the square. She had forgotten how much she loved it. Brennan had taken that from her too. Not by forbidding it, but by filling her days with so much anxiety that there was no room left for creation. Now the room was hers again. At 10 o'clock there was a knock at the door. Marit checked the peephole, a habit she would never lose, and smiled. Kestrel stood there with a paper bag from the bakery. Croissants? Fresh. Still warm. "You're bribing me. Is it working?" Marit opened the door. They sat at the small table and talked about nothing important. Kestrel's job at the veterinary clinic. A movie she had seen. Ordinary conversation. The kind Marit had been denied for 14 months. She cherished every word. At 11:30, Petra arrived. She had moved to the city 2 months ago. She lived 4 blocks away. The 3 of them spent the afternoon together. They cooked lunch. They talked. They watched an old movie. And at 5 o'clock, when the rain had stopped and the sun was breaking through, Marit stood at her window and looked out at the city. 4 months ago, she had been standing at an altar, trapped. Now she was standing in her own apartment, surrounded by people who loved her. On a Tuesday evening in late April, Marit walked into St. Aurelius Cathedral. She had not planned to come. She had been walking through the city when she realized she was only 2 blocks away. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building, the stained glass windows, the oak doors, the marble steps where photographers had positioned her 4 months ago. Marit climbed the steps and pushed open the door. The cathedral was empty. Late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting colored shadows across the pews. She walked down the aisle. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. She stopped at the front row and sat down. The last time she had been here, she had been wearing a $14,000 dress and holding a bouquet with a phone hidden inside. Now she was wearing jeans and a sweater. Her hair was loose. Her hands were empty. She sat there for a long time, looking at the altar. And she thought about the woman she had been. The woman who had stood up there, shaking, whispering into a phone, begging for someone to come. That woman had been so afraid, so certain that there was no way out. But she had been wrong. There was a way out. It had been terrifying. It had required help from strangers. It had demanded more courage than she knew she had. But it existed, and she had taken it. Marit reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, the wedding ring. She had kept it because she needed to decide what to do with it. Now she knew. She stood up. She walked to the altar. She placed the ring on the white cloth, exactly where she had stood when she made vows she had never meant. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle. She did not look back. Kalen Voss sat in a black car across the street from St. Aurelius Cathedral. He had not followed Marit here. He had been driving through the neighborhood when he saw her climb the steps. He had told Tiernan to stop the car. 20 minutes later, the cathedral doors opened. Marit emerged into the late afternoon light. Her shoulders were straight. Her stride was unhurried. She looked like a woman who had just set something down that she had been carrying for a very long time. She walked down the steps and turned left, toward the river. She did not see the black car. She did not need to. Kalen watched her until she disappeared around the corner. Then he sat back and closed his eyes. He thought about his mother, about the kitchen in the Ashford projects, the sound of her ribs breaking, the way she had whispered, "We're fine." He thought about the hospital bed, the promise. "Promise me you'll become strong enough to stop it." He had spent 39 years keeping that promise. And now, sitting in a car outside a cathedral where a woman had walked in carrying a ring and walked out carrying nothing, he felt something ease inside his chest. Not resolution. There would always be another woman, another whisper, another door that needed to open. But something. A weight. Lifted. A promise. Honored. A boy behind a kitchen door, finally given the power to do what he couldn't do at 9 years old. Kalen opened his eyes. "Drive," he said to Tiernan. The car pulled away and merged into traffic. And Kalen Voss did not look back. 8 months after the wedding that never truly ended, Marit Lindgren received a letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, delivered by a courier who asked for no signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation. No signature. Just 3 lines. "The Bellamy Museum is looking for a restoration specialist. They would be fortunate to have you. The application deadline is Friday." Marit stared at the letter for a long time. Then she walked to her window and looked out at the street. The flower shop was open. The old woman was on her stoop. The pigeons were gathering. Ordinary life. Her life. She sat down at her small table, opened her laptop, and began to write. In her apartment in the Northwick district, a deadbolt waited faithfully in its locked position. But it wasn't holding anything out anymore. It was holding something in. A woman who had learned to braid her own future. Who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Who had stood at an altar and whispered a prayer into a hidden phone and discovered that sometimes, impossibly, the answer comes. Not from the person you called, but from the person who happened to be listening. Outside, the spring wind moved through the city. And somewhere in the quiet of a locked apartment, a woman who had once been a ghost began, at last, to live.